about themselves at first, and then we'll get into the actual topics. And so we do have Constantine Carb. I wash my mouth and I can't do anything with it today. And I have met Constantine many, many times. So I apologize. At times you just kind of have those moments. So Carbaliotis. And then we have Neil Beaton on, and we have George Uzzi on. And I'm going to have them spend just a few seconds because there's some interesting things about their background and their experience that's pretty exciting. I'm going to have them talk maybe starting with Constantine for maybe just a couple of seconds about yourself, your bio, and then please do us a favor. Tell us a fun, fast fact about yourself. And so we'll go Constantine, we'll go Neil, and then we'll go George Uzzi, which I forgot to introduce George. I love George, so I'm sorry, George, if I didn't introduce you right away. So anyways, let's start with Constantine.
Thank you, Valerie, and I thank you so much for having me here. And I understand the challenge when you kind of are confronted with my name. I've had to deal with that quite a lot. The way to think of this, though, is as I was been introduced in the past, as the biggest name in privacy.
That's
Anyway,
good. I like
yeah,
that.
and so the fun fact is that I at least have convinced myself, if not a few others, that I am one of the funniest guys in privacy. And my wife's retort is, well, you're not competing against much, so okay. Um, but my background is I am a lawyer called in Ontario, Canada, and your viewers are probably wondering why the heck you'd be listening to me right now. I'm also had been responsible for two multinational privacy programs. I used to be at Symantec. I was a chief privacy officer at Mercer. So I have a bit of a more of international sort of perspective, having dealt with U.S., EU, Canadian privacy issues over the past 20 years. That's me.
Amazing. Yes, and I think that as we are dealing with globalization, it's so relevant and timely to talk to the globe, not just to the United States alone. And we have a lot to learn from each other. So this is awesome. Way, way fabulous. And Neil, do you want to kind of introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, Neil Beaton. I am with DRT Cyber. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of Schedule One bank up here in Canada. I'm in London, Ontario right now, but I'm from Montreal originally. VersaBank is the first branchless bank in North America. Uh, Opened up as a branchless bank back in 1993 using modems pre-internet. So we've always been more technologically advanced, and we launched DRT Cyber to provide cybersecurity services at the bank, and have expanded that to provide cybersecurity and privacy services externally as well. Um, Fun fact, I guess, a recurring theme in my life. I've been a lifelong rugby player for 40 plus years, and I have had some of the most significant moves in my professional life associated with people directly that I knew because of rugby. From being hired in fairly significant positions at a certain time in my life to starting an entire new business for the bank years ago when I was working directly for VersaBank, to just recently a new business opportunity for both the bank and DRT Cyber, and every one of those was tied to somebody that I knew from that. So there you go.
Awesome. Rugby. Love it. Love it. Any like we'll talk offline about injuries because I have friends that are rugby players and they have good war stories from it
It,
all.
it's a,
So
it's
that's
an
awesome.
interesting community to be part of.
Definitely is. And I've had some really uh, fun viewing of rugby. So that's awesome. So thank you so much for being here today. And then we're going to have George Uzzi from Omnistruct. He's the CEO. I'll let you just kind of tell your fun fast fact, George, and a little bit about you.
All right, I'll start with what is essentially a little bit about me. I've been in internet governance, internet backbone design is kind of where my career started. setting internet standards in backbone design and private peer, public peer networks. That's my engineering background, but I have been in business within the networking, security, and risk management space for over 30 years. My fun fact is that I am a blacksmith, so I spend quite a bit of time um, uh, volunteering my time in some of the local history areas. I live in Folsom area, a town next to Folsom. And of course, there's quite a bit of gold rush history here in California. So, or as I like to say, for those of you that struggle with my last name, what I often say is if you see cyber risk, you see UC. So you'll never forget how to properly pronounce my last name moving forward.
I wish I could do something like that. I can't.
Not as simple a solution for Constantine at all.
Mine's simple last name, and everybody still gets it wrong, so it doesn't matter.
I don't know
I just
why. My favorite salad.
I was gonna say it's a Cobb salad, corn on the cob. We all had the jokes,
Yeah,
all
yeah.
of that kind of stuff. But so how I like to run these roundtables is I really like it to be very conversational because I find that juicy nuggets will come out when it's very conversational. And so, everybody who is listening, this is very unscripted on purpose. So, there may be a few flubs. There may be a few, like I said, sometimes I have to I didn't wash my mouth well enough today. So,
Mhm.
we end up with something coming out the wrong way. So, anyways, and so let's have a good amount of fun with this. We are going to kind of have the dialogue go around the key takeaways, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A, individually or collectively, and guide some of those things through. And I would love to hear some of the kind of the stories behind some of your answers, and instead of just the rote regulatory privacy answers. And Neil, you brought up something very interesting, and I know that some listening understand the difference and the distinction between privacy and cybersecurity. I find that risk, cybersecurity, or security and privacy, there's really a nexus that kind of comes together. And I think sometimes when we say the word cybersecurity, it's all tool related and stopping things. And so I do love the idea of ethical hacking because we're also going to talk about that a little bit. But in one of our key takeaways, we're trying to get a systemic view of the risk and organizational impacts of that risk. So I'm just going to open it up to the panelists. What are we doing about this systemic view of risk and basically the organizational impact? Because we've got AI, we've got all of this new kind of things happening in the United States. We've had even a presidential regime change in the last week. There's a lot going on that can be talked about, and especially within risk and privacy on this. So I just want to ask that question to the panel.
Uh, I'm going to start because, George, you mentioned gold rushes. And that's really, I think, kind of an interesting theme to start with because, I think we're in the midst of a gold rush, which is generated by AI. And everyone is realizing that data is, the old expression, the new oil. I hate that one. Maybe it's the new gold. I don't know. But what is the common elements of gold rushes? Bodies strewn along the side of the road as people are heading towards that, ideal, where is that mother lode? And also, who always makes money in gold rushes? Bankers and lawyers. Okay, so, I think we are perhaps a little bit going to have to realize that there's a bit of a bubble, and so there's of course going to have to be some, coming down to earth. Will AI be significant in terms of altering the way we work? Absolutely. Is it changing the way that we approach technology? Is it enhancing our ability to solve problems? Absolutely. Is it going to end up replacing most people? Doubtful. I think it's going to become as essential to our day-to-day working lives as Microsoft Word or Outlook is. And we're just going to have to learn to use it, and we're going to be seeing productivity gains from this. But there's also got to be some understanding of the systemic risks. We started by mentioning that before you introduce this sort of stuff. And you also, talking to Neil's talked about, sort of data and sort of like the central sort of themes of all these sort of disparate areas that we've treated as separate. And it's data that's at the core of all of this. And I think that if what I would hope we would get across through a conversation today to your listeners is that siloed approaches to risk is how you're not going to deal with systemic risk. Systemic risk requires a much more holistic view, a much broader set of voices and viewpoints within the organization and maybe from without, because most organizations aren't equipped today to address the risks that they've got. And I'll stop talking and let the others share their thoughts.
Well, if I can jump in there, I think one of the big things facing everybody is just the sheer depth and breadth, overall scope of the impact of AI and machine learning in terms of the mixed impacts of both opportunities and threats. Opportunities can become threats if they're mismanaged or mishandled from a privacy or security standpoint. And there's also opportunities to counter some of the direct threats that the bad guys using AI and machine learning are using, and you can actually use the same sort of tools to counter that sort of thing. And I think that's probably something that, in my view, that a lot of people struggle with is just there's so much to this, and AI is such a buzzword these days, and all these sorts of things. Constantine makes a very good point. You don't want to start looking at things in a siloed fashion because of the depth and breadth of it. And Valerie, as you mentioned, there's always a significant overlap between security, risk, and privacy. And you have to take those things into account. But then you also do have to sort of slice and dice it a little bit to try to have manageable approaches to dealing with each one of those aspects, whether it's from a training standpoint or from using a tool or being aware of the tools, all of the various things that the companies need to do, and the MSPs and MSSPs of the world that are advising companies about this. So I think just acknowledging that there's so much to this and that it touches so many different areas is an important first step. And then, despite the fact that you might need to slice and dice it to get it into manageable bites, you don't want those manageable bites to be siloed, because then you're going to set yourself up for some trouble. So I think that's a fairly good point from Constantine. I don't know if you want to add anything there, George.
I'm going to go and continue with the gold rush analogy there. So, the interesting thing in risk management is the idea that you can find your gold and find your riches, and the data being the gold, obviously here. But what I find intriguing about the risk management side is that, and in parallel with the gold rush, the company that actually made the most money was the water company, because you can't mine gold without water. I see present day service providers, the cloud-based providers, and those organizations as the water companies for the data, right? So it's impossible to get it done without them. So it does become almost I would argue, from a risk perspective, when you're making investments in security, you're making investments in managing risk, that it is a very much buyer beware situation. And only time will tell to see if that converts to a seller beware situation. At the moment, you can purchase services from Microsoft Azure, and they claim that they'll be fully accountable for your regulations, whether it's a CMMC, GCC high environment or not. But ultimately, what makes it a risk position is that there have been cases in, let's just call them cyber laws, that have basically focused an organization on their own risk management, and that you cannot transfer out risk completely. You have to treat it. So it's kind of like these miners that were mining for gold. They had to have buckets of water or figure out some way to get water to their claim. If not, they couldn't mine the data. And ultimately, if they become accountable for what essentially is their responsibility to manage that data, become good stewards of that data, they are going to have to put the right risk management program in place. And so I call that the convergence of cybersecurity and risk. So ultimately, the businesses don't want to become the victims of the water companies, so to speak, right? Or the cloud providers, because the litigation that we've seen, and I'll use a major CRM as an example, dealing with a clothing company. There was a compromise, and a certain omnibus data privacy law resulted in legal pursuit of the company that had the breach, as well as the content provider or the CRM provider. They were both equally up to bat and accountable for the loss of the data, even though the service provider, or we'll call it the CRM provider, never actually made any mistakes. It was ultimately because that company was inside of their environment. They got thrown into the legal matter. So I think what you're going to see is you're going to see more and more litigation and more matters come to the front. And that is going to delineate what decisions might be made either by industry. Of course, the more aggressive the sanction. For example, CMMC, if you have a violation there as a CEO, it could potentially be criminal for you from the perspective of what we'll refer to essentially as signing a contract saying you are compliant with CMMC, and then you're not, and you get caught and you don't remedy, and now as a CEO you are accountable for that. Whereas most of the other sanctions are money, right? Sure, I'll pay some money, but I don't want to go to jail. So depending upon how you look at each of those situations, or I want to get in criminal trouble, I shouldn't say go to jail, but there's a different level of civil liability, and for the executives and the board. And so I think what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot more regulatory and statutory mandates. And I want to be super clear that there are already, at least in this country, many bipartisan mandates in privacy laws. So we know that. But as we get into industry, only time will tell. But if you're a modern organization and you're not preparing for risk management within your accidental disclosure of data, or an accidental takeover of your OT, IoT environment, like water companies, and there have been incidents that are not privacy related, but actually there have been incidents where hackers have taken over the grid, so to speak, and poisoned the water supply in a city. So fortunately, that water treatment plant caught it before the water went out. So it's not always just the data is the point. And I think that's why you see CMMC and you see critical infrastructure protection. So, and I've already spoken too much, so I'll shut up now.
I did want to pick up on when you mentioned the regulatory frameworks and the liabilities that are developing. And I think it's important to keep an eye on, for instance, Europe, the EU AI Act, because it's recognized that there is an environment. So from the provider to the deployer to the importer or distributor to the user, each has its own set of obligations along the path. And it's instructive, I think, because many US states are looking at the EU AI Act as a model, that it's more not so much a information governance or privacy law like we think of GDPR. It's a product management, product liability law. And that means that AIs are going to get the CE symbol the same way that you'll see them on hair dryers or TVs, because that's a very interesting sort of shift in thinking. And also, in addition to that, there is regulatory moves in the EU around liability, and questions coming up in cases in the US about whether strict or absolute liability applies in certain circumstances. This is all unresolved as yet, and it's ripe for legislative intervention. because we are relying on this technology in much the same fashion as we rely on the safety of, say, electronic devices. So I think it's going to represent a shift, as George is saying, in terms of how liability is applied and the consequences for organizations. Because it's not just the regulator is going to slap you around. It's going to be that you're going to have lawsuits, that you're going to have maybe regulatory sanctions. So the consequences are getting increasingly greater as time goes on. And we'll point out one thing because we're going to lead into some conversation about ethics. So, what is ethics? Ethics is putting the cart in the shopping area back in the stall where it belongs, even though nobody's watching.
You're
Sorry,
laughing.
simplistic example, but it's about doing the right thing. What happens when you don't do the right thing? You might get a law named after you because that's when
Yeah.
legislators react, right? So there's certainly, I would say, an enlightened self-interest to keeping one eye on, is just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. You'll always be given, as one judge said when I was in court, enough rope to hang yourself. Again, maybe goes back to the good old days of the gold rushes. So there's some learnings we should remember from those times, and that again, a reaction to people playing fast and loose is always going to be a legislative reaction. So I think that it's may make sense to talk about ethics at this point because again, and I'm sure you're all aware of the Target case from a couple of years ago, in which a young woman, 16 years old, started receiving all sorts of advertisements and information about pregnancy, and her dad flipped his lid and went and complained publicly. How dare they do this? And well, what did Target know that the family didn't? She was pregnant based on her purchasing habits. It's that depth of information that we have to now start thinking about the consequences, right? When we think about systemic risk, we have to think about not just, are we creating a mechanism for hackers to get in? My public service announcement is always turn off voice recognition on your banking services because all that bad guys need is about 7 seconds of your audio, and that's why they're calling you on your phone, to get your voicemail, your voice message. Turn that off. Go to your standardized greeting and turn off biometric sort of recognition through voice recognition on your banking. Why? Because these are the risks that organizations now have to contemplate. What was intended as a security feature is now a security flaw. So we've got to think for our consumers, our taxpayers, our citizens, in a different way to enhance their cybersecurity, their privacy, because their data is the asset we're trying to manage.
I think that's where the disconnect is. And as I'm facilitating, I'm going to ask this question because it's a great segue into the ethical parts of this. And I use the meme about Google buying Pizza Hut all the way down to somebody saying, well, I'm just going to go live on an island. Hey, many of us, a lot of our to let's just we all suggestions, we all get those things. We have an uproar of our outcomes of some kind of that sort. Yet I find 40% of them are going to adhere, and the rest stick their head in the sand. So percent sticking their head in the sand, right? And organizational ethics, it looks like In fact, when I've talked to people, it's like, oh, that's not going to happen to me.
Well,
One of the things that I'd say on that, Valerie, is
Yeah.
we've already alluded to the fact, and it's just going to be an ongoing thing. Government regulation is never going to keep up with the speed and rate of technological change and all of the things that they need to try to put guardrails around. So
Mm-hmm.
that brings you back to what is the corporate culture that your company has in how they're dealing with their customer. And you can call it ethical, which is 100% something to consider. But the other thing to consider is just how do you want to be treated as a consumer? And you should treat your consumers the same way. Um, so knowing that all of these capabilities are out there from a technology standpoint to both leverage and potentially exploit in a negative way uh, technological advances, you need to look at that from your business and make sure that you're not treating your customer the way you wouldn't want to be treated yourself. Um, the opportunity to leverage data in a negative way as perceived by your customers can have a long lasting effect. So there's a real business reason to do it other than just purely ethical. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's you sort of want to have a
Sure.
confluence of the two. Um,
Yeah.
and having that as part of how you approach your business and how your business manifests itself with your partners and customers and your own employees as well. There's, you've got to consider your employees in all of this too, from a privacy standpoint and that sort of thing, and a security standpoint, is something that is becoming more and more important and more relevant because of the rate of change and because the regulations aren't going to be able to keep up with it. So waiting for something to become a law that you can be threatened with from a fine standpoint or whatever the regulatory standpoint is probably not the best approach. And customers and consumers are becoming more and more savvy and more aware of what's out there and what's not, and what they like and what they don't like. And if you can sort of try to stay ahead of that curve, or at least keep up with it, I think you're going to be better placed.
I want to draw some themes that you've brought up, Neil, because I think that in conjunction, ethics, good stewardship of data yields trust, which
Yeah.
enables you to do more with data. Your customers will enable you to do more with data if they trust you. I think that's been longstanding. And I think that the connection we need to help organizations see is that good ethics yields good stewardship of the asset, which is apparently the most valuable asset we have today is information. Yet, if you look how most organizations, at 40% you're referring to, Valerie, if data is the new oil, it's on fire. Nobody would get away with treating a physical asset the way that we treat data. They'd be fired if they were writing checks for this amount of money that data represents. So I think that what we've got to get back to is understanding this is an ethical obligation. It's also, again, enlightened self-interest. If this is the asset that matters today, then treat it like an asset, not just a collection of electrons that are disposable. So I think we've got to make that connection clear that this is not a either or proposition. Either we do the right thing or we sacrifice business. I think that's a false dichotomy, and if we get caught in that, then that's why organizations are, as you said, putting their heads in the sand. They think that's the alternative.
Yeah. Well, I get to ask the juicy question that people are
Yeah.
thinking and throw it in there, but that is what many have come up against, and I know that IT professionals come up against that within their own organizations. Even it's, oh, we don't need this.
Well, and
I know George has a few things to say about that too.
Well, before
Sorry.
and George alluded to some of the liabilities and so on that are issues that are coming up. I would say that
Mhm.
it is also increasingly the case that courts don't buy that when privacy officers or CISOs complain we need funding or resources to do something,
Mhm.
they're not going to be simply the sacrificial lamb. And, it's who's responsible? The board, ultimately, and management. George, you may want to take over from that point. Just
I'm sorry. I just knew
yeah,
that he had some things too to
yeah,
say
yeah,
on it.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, for this question of ethics is very easy for me because ultimately we live in a global economy, and I can mention and identify lots of companies, international companies, and let's not pretend like the U.S. is perfect either, where business ethics was just a notated academic class in college. It's generally revenue and sales that and laws, right? So they'll operate within the guidelines of whatever the regulations are required. And this takes us back to the very simple concept of, how an organization's culture is driven at the executive level is going to be tied to sales ultimately, because and CMMC is a great example of that. If you don't have it, I'm not giving you the contract. But the buyer beware versus seller beware reference that I made earlier, there are already companies that are taking a position of seller beware. There's certain companies that handle payroll at scale. If you look at their contract that you're signing as a business, whether you're small or mid, they're transferring a considerable amount, unreasonably transferring risk to you when you sign that contract when it comes to the data of your own employees. So read your contracts. That's the answer to how ethics will cascade, and it will happen from the seller beware perspective. But they'll continue to take the larger companies are doing it. So they're going to give you a contract. You're going to sign it. You're paying them. You ask for a red line. They go, no way. It's either that or you don't have a payroll company, right? now you're kind of in that same situation with cloud companies. Well, sign with one of us, and here's our terms. You try to redline one of those contracts. Good luck. It's not going to happen. So
But that then puts the responsibility back on the company, like you were saying earlier.
that's
right?
correct. So the
Yeah.
transference of risk is already happening through contractual obligations. And so ultimately that's going to be the driver. It's not going to be stopping the hacker. It's going to be about what business you're able to earn as a CEO and the board. They're like, hey man, we better do this, or we're not going to earn these we're going to have these contracts cancel on us. And that scares any executive. And obviously the revenue leads as well. And I know this is something that Valerie and I have discussed in the past, is like, what if you can't play because you're not achieving a certain standard? And arguably there's going to be more of them. I think they're going to be more stringent by industry. That's what's happening in Europe. I think it was a good advice to watch Europe. And arguably, the executive team will have to cascade ethical and cultural requirements or behaviors within their organizations. It's not going to be the IT department pushing on you, or the CISO pushing on you to get things done. It's going to be the other way around. You'll see marketing is going to shape up and ship up really quick when they find out that they're accountable because they chose a vendor for building websites, and it becomes the origin of the compromise. And so that's what is going to be noticed, is those third-party supply chains, third-party risk management functions. As those become more critical from larger, right now it's mostly the larger companies cascading it down to the smaller. And as you buy and you read that contract, you're like, well, I need the service. If you're a small business, you're just going to sign, right? You're probably not even going to send it by legal if you're small enough, right? So ultimately, the point, I think, is that if you want things to be ethical, and this is going to sound completely backwards, hire an attorney to do a legal, regulatory impact assessment.
Nice plug.
Yes, I like that.
We're not attorneys, so it's a nice plug.
Yeah.
Constantine is.
Yeah.
I know. I'm saying Omnistruct is not an attorney.
But I think you make a really important point. I mean, what I've seen in the last few years is that there's this really, as you were saying, trying to shift the risk, but also increasing demands, especially on the mid and smaller size companies. Don't get me into trouble. When the power is on the other side, they're requiring GDPR compliance with NIST, various NIST frameworks. Why? Because they're the ones that are going to own the breach ultimately if they're subcontracting to you. And so they don't want you dragging them into a problem. And so what I've seen is that what's driven the conversation more powerfully than, and George, you mentioned this, regulation is, you want to make revenue? You're going to have to do certain things in order to make sure that your business partners have confidence in you. Otherwise, you're going to go somewhere else. Now, they are, as you point out, in the middle of like not getting any commitments from the big tech companies, but having expectations on the other side from their customers. So it leaves them with the responsibility. You can't offload this by contract to have the right cybersecurity, privacy, AI governance in place. Let's go back to the gold rush kind of analogy in the bodies by the side of the road. Because what is happening is the ground is shifting underneath many companies' feet. How many of those big tech providers are suddenly going, I want to monetize your data? Your payroll information is really interesting. I'm going to, the feature I'm offering you is AI baked into your payroll. But why are they doing that? Because they want to scrape the data. They want the value of the information. And suddenly you've got to go be wondering, are they going to be using this to educate my competitors as to my salary structures? Am I putting my employees at risk? What is happening with the information? And this is the contracting question we keep asking when we talk about AI: is my data going to train your model, and are you going to now exploit that? And why am I not getting the benefit of my data? So these are the contracting issues that are coming out now. And George, you point out, I think that small medium businesses are really in an unfortunate sort of middle where they don't have the bargaining power to really get what out from underneath the liability on one side or impose it on the other. And that leaves them with no option but to really get their governance under control, like to understand this a systemic risk that they're engaged in, because they're going to be the bodies along the side of the road.
Yeah, I think there's probably a parallel, industry parallel here, that could be compared. And ultimately, I often say that we almost are helpless when most businesses, I should say, are helpless when it comes to resourcing to address these issues, and especially when a hacker succeeds. And so, to some degree, you can parallel this to the fire brigades in the industry of firefighting. So, when fires broke out in cities, the fires essentially would burn, and some fire brigades would just show up. They'd see the smoke and they'd say, "Hey, $100 to put out the fire." Okay, and you hand them $100 and they'd put the fire out, right? Then another competitor would show up and then they would compete with each other, 100, 90, 80, and they'd put your fire out. Well, it got really nasty, and so eventually they introduced insurance companies. Sound familiar? Insurance companies came in, basically started getting involved with these situations, and now they would basically deploy their fire brigade that was on panel in the insurance days. But ultimately, those insurance companies started setting their competitors' customers' businesses on fire. So that didn't work. And eventually it became, now we have public sector cyber fire department. Well, there's a reason why CISA exists. It's kind of like I guess you would, to some degree, call it our or national, the U.S. Cyber Fire Department. We're going to need regionals as well. And ultimately, I think how it's going to happen is not necessarily the public sector coming in and handling cyber risk and handling cybersecurity. I think what's going to happen is there's going to be requirements and litigation around what essentially are these large tech companies and the contracts they may make a small business sign. And so that's going to take time, though. So we've got 5, 6, 7 years at least before all of the current frameworks and privacy laws, especially privacy laws, omnibus data privacy laws, and even potentially a federal privacy law in the next decade. Those are going to take time. So in the meantime, you're paying the fire brigade or the insurance company. Right?
I was alarmed by the thought of negotiating with the fire brigade at the point that your house is on fire. Except I realized that that's most ransomware situations.
That's right. And so, really, what an incident is it's a digital cyber fire, right?
Yeah.
The difference, though, is that there are different kinds, right? The insurances that you purchase are generally designed for your own house if it burns down, but you can have a forest fire as well. And a forest fire is when SolarWinds is a great example of that. If you remember that incident, it's software that's used to manage networks. That caught fire, and then the whole forest burned down. Cisco, AT&T, I mean, every big tech company you could name. I generally don't like to name those companies, but it is public information. And so they all burned. It was a forest fire, and it made
And
the news.
it doesn't have to be deliberate. The CrowdStrike is even more recent one. Again, systemic risk means understanding your supply chain, right?
Right.
And your environment.
So ultimately, it doesn't matter who you chose. If you
Yeah.
chose a product, and that product is the where the incident originated, fine. You're still accountable for that risk. So how did you? Can you prove to me that you did the right thing, especially when nobody was watching, by following framework A, or following this regulation, or following the statutory requirement? Did you at least try? It's really, contrary to Yoda, it's not about, do, it's about try right now,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Well,
I mean,
you're,
a privacy impact assessment is ultimately a defensive document. I tried to be reasonable.
That's correct. And that's exactly where an impact assessment has benefit is, and we've seen it many times, but ultimately most organizations, right, they're going to do, especially small businesses, they're going to do everything they can to avoid paying an attorney because it's outside counsel, it's not inside counsel, and they know how expensive it can get. But what I like to remind people is that there's a kind of 4-letter word here in California in HR law called a PAGA lawsuit. Any CFO or CEO, oh my gosh, that's hourly wage issues where all your employee records get subpoenaed so they can find all your time clock violations, and it gets enormous, dollars wise. Some of these cyber sanctions are going to be like that. So it's going to become more of an executive and board level known issue because it's going to be just as risky as human resource concerns in just time clock management. So I think that would be maybe a good idea for an executive to really consider that maybe it is time that I put on my schedule and my budget at least a triennial or even an annual, regulatory legal impact assessment as my business changes or when I make a major change. I'm doing that. It's protected underprivilege ideally, but ultimately, if you can't afford underprivilege, right? You're a small business. You're going to have to do the assessment with an organization that specializes in those that may provide a little bit more risk coverage and be able to defend you to some degree with the proof of documentation. And then insurance may help you. So it's about getting ahead of proving your cyber risk position.
well,
That's what we're
the
seeing.
whole cyber insurance industry, like everything else, is evolving right now, right?
Yeah.
And insurance companies are obviously in the business of receiving payments and not making payments. So they're looking very closely in this particular area about how they can mitigate their own risk as it pertains to the insurance policies that they put out and what their customers are doing, or they're going to tell them that they should be doing, whether it's from a defensive or operational standpoint. Are you using these types of tools to the PIAs and to the cybersecurity testing? Are you doing the proper pen testing and all of those sorts of things? And can you say, put your hand up and say, yes, we've done this. And oh, by the way, here's an important thing that happens all too frequently is you have your cybersecurity pen test done for whatever it is, a web app test or mobile app test, external pen test, what have you. When you get that report, what have you done to remediate it? Because just the simple
It's a
fact
report.
the simple fact of saying, yes, I did a pen test is the first step, but it's what you've done on an ongoing basis, including the remediation of the results of that test. That's what's important for the cyber insurance company and ultimately for you, your board, and your shareholders and all of that sort of thing. So the insurance analogy is incredibly relevant because that's an evolving industry as we speak. And trust me, the insurance providers are struggling with it as well because of everything that we're talking about today, the complexity of the technology and all of those sorts of things.
When you referred to the 40%, Valerie, I think of them responding to the cyber insurance questionnaires, which are getting incredibly detailed now, in the form of like somebody who's applying for life insurance who's a 2-pack a day smoker saying, "No, I've never smoked." And as Neil said, the insurance companies don't like to pay out if they don't have to. But if you haven't been able to, as George said, document that you've done some of the right things in advance of the bad thing happening, then your cyber insurance is a pretty effective regulator too, right? Because you're going to find they're not going to pay out. And that's going to leave you then at, explaining to the owners, the shareholders, why you didn't. So I think that the stars are aligning, ethics, legal, regulatory, but just basic business realities are
Yeah,
going to compel organizations to be responsible over their data like it's an asset.
I
I
I
go crazy.
agree.
What a crazy concept, right? And that's the cultural shift both Neil and George have been alluding to is we've got to start treating this something like it's valuable and worrying about it from the point of view of that is what generates revenue for the organization. So maybe we should be protecting it better and not treating it, as I said before, like a bunch of loose electrons.
Yeah,
So I think that you know we can talk about how AI can support us in doing this because there's many tools. And Neil, I'm not pushing this specifically for you because you've already said nice things about how people should retain lawyers. But you should be using tools that actually, again, automate this because again, many organizations don't have the time and the resources to do everything themselves. And there's many services now that can support, again, the automation of the pen testing, the remediations. We've got to know that the bad guys are out there using the tools, right?
yes, they
My
are.
favorite example lately, which I love to scare the pants off of people with, was this poor fellow in South Korea who was on a call with, he thought, 5 other people. He was the only real person. The others were AI generated. And they persuaded him to send $25 million to a bank account, which of course then meant it promptly disappeared. So this is the threat landscape that we're operating in now. It is it probably is becoming trite to say it's the realm of science fiction when it's not science fiction anymore. It's reality.
Yeah.
We imagined these things 20, 30 years ago, and they're happening now. And I think that, to George's point earlier, is that many organizations still are not very cognizant of what these risks are. There's a lack of education, I think. That's what maybe your viewers need to take with them is we have to we always had to educate in privacy, but it's increasingly important that boards and management really understand the environment. I mean, the SEC in December last year updated its requirements to report cybersecurity breaches. Okay, only 9% of public companies apparently have a technology committee. All the other cyber reporting goes to whom? The audit committee. Wait a second, they're responsible for the financial statements. You've got to start thinking about this again from the point of view of knowledge, specialty, getting the right advisors if you don't have them, so that you can cope with all of these massive systemic risks that are happening as we speak.
I'm going to segue, and I know apparently my internet's a little bit spotty, and I'm not sure why, so I apologize to everybody. But I'm going to segue a little bit. We're gonna be rounding this up a little bit, and Neil, this is a little bit going to be directed at you as well, but kind of tying all this together. I've worked in so many industries, and I think that humans understand tangible, physical product. I remember when SaaS was a thing, and now we call it a product, but it really isn't, right? It's just a payment model of sorts. But at the end of the day, I remember in the era in the 90s, and yes, it dates me, my mother-in-law had to be told over the phone by me after troubleshooting, oh, did you turn the button on the computer? And believe it or not, she hadn't even turned it on because it was so out of the realm of her thinking. And I think sometimes with cyber feeling intangible, and there's my camera going rock and roll. feeling intangible, starting with some of that ethical hacking, which I love that Neil has that on DRT's website. The ethical hacking portion of it feels a bit tangible to people, where governance and risk, they don't even understand it. So talking contracts, they read a contract, they don't understand the verbiage. George says, go talk to an attorney, you should, but small businesses won't. So I think Neil, in this question, and we'll have this be the last question and we'll have to round that up, is more about how you're bridging that gap. AI feels intangible, right? It feels a bit like the historical smoke that people just don't understand. And we know that the hackers are way ahead of any regulatory. We don't, I mean, that's just like, yes, they use the same tools. And because you talk about some of the pen testing and some of the ethical hacking, showing what you need to remediate, how are you helping your organizations bridge that gap? Because Constantine and George are kind of in what I would call what they feel is the smoke arena. That's when something's already happened and we're dealing with risk after the fact, but they're not really, they're
Yeah,
preventing. So how do you bridge
reactive
that
as
gap?
opposed to preventative.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
and thanks for that, Valerie. Yes, and then this is not a sales pitch sort of thing. That's not the purpose of any of this. But the answer is
yeah.
the preventative part involves testing. And the good news is, as Constantine alluded to, uh, and as you just said, the bad guys are using this stuff to come at you. Well, you know what? You can mirror the same things and techniques that the bad guys are using and use it for ethical hacking to find those vulnerabilities and then address them, remediate them, take care of them. And whether you're using people or machines to do that, it's just it's an ongoing thing that's going to be a fact of life and should be a fact of life for any major corporation. Uh, the fact that we can take those same threats that the bad guys are using and convert them into a tool that allows you to remediate those threats and understand those threats before they become something that you need to react and respond to after the fact, after the horse is out of the barn sort of thing, is where a lot of the value is going forward. So being able to use AI and machine learning in a fully autonomous fashion without people involved, and autonomous and automated are not the same thing at all. Automated is a tool that a person uses but still needs to interact. Autonomous is the tool doing it itself, and that's where the AI and machine learning comes in and completely replaces that piece. And that capability then gives companies the ability to do it on demand, repeatably, all the other things that come with that. So those are the sorts of things that companies can look at and investigate, do their due diligence to say, hey, what tools are available for me? And then there's all the operational and defensive stuff. And again, we just happen not to be involved in that. We're purely on the testing side. But there's all kinds of operational and defensive tools that you should be using, again, to block things from happening. Everybody knows what a firewall is, but there's a whole lot of other sort of stuff that's more sophisticated out there to prevent all sorts of things. And, phishing attacks are the number one threat vector in terms of volume of attacks and dollar value of attacks by far. So there's a lot of things that you can do from both a technology standpoint, and clearly a training thing is another big deal. Training your employees to know exactly what the threats look like and how to deal with them or how to avoid them. Don't click this, don't open, the obvious stuff. But there's a whole lot more that you can get into a lot more depth. Those are the things that companies should be doing to, again, prevent these things from happening before they do. So you're not trying to hire somebody to stop your house from burning down because it's already on fire. You want to prevent the fire in the first place, right? Have your smoke alarms and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And the strategy to know which ones, right? I know Constantine and George have talked a bit about that. So George is smiling. So you want to add to that, George?
Yeah, we're still burning candles in our houses digitally. That's the problem. So fires are going to happen, and it's the smaller, it's the community and the smaller businesses that really are going to have the most trouble. And ultimately, um, they don't necessarily have all of the resources they need to, or even the mindset. In some cases, their heads are in the wrong spot. to essentially see themselves as a target, to see, oh, I'm using a candle, it's not going to tip over, right? But sometimes they have to learn that lesson the hard way, and ultimately some businesses will fail. And I think the best remedy right now for most businesses is your communities. So you can go to, I know Reddit is very active amongst the technical community, so you can go into Reddit and there's a community for you. And lots of people, it's kind of like that social interaction to understand, hey, what was your experience with this problem in the business? And so a lot of the firefighters, so to speak, the guys that are trying to prepare for the fire, they want to be proactive. So let's stop the hacker before they get in. And that's been for 52 years. That's been the mindset. Well, that's not working. So, now you have to have a mindset of, okay, I'm going to prepare for when the hacker succeeds too. And there are probably going to be some cases where I need to steal from Peter to pay Paul. So I'm going to take from this other budget. Maybe I'm not going to buy that ransomware solution from XYZ company because I don't have the budget for it. So I'm going to shift it into what essentially is a risk management arena, because if I'm going to get hit anyway, right, I at least I'll have the proof that I tried, right? And so I think you're going to see some negotiation internally where, because if you don't have a budget and you don't know where it's coming from, you either have to be creative like that, which I don't recommend. This is where you have to, as a let's call it ground war specialist, you have to learn how to talk to the executives and help them understand the risk. If you don't do that, you're not going to get that budget unless the CFO and the CEO and the board realizes that perhaps the next law will come after their personal assets, or maybe there are laws already that do. So, and then you're back to the attorney, right? So it's convergence. It's risk converging with cybersecurity, and now your attorney is your best friend in terms of getting budget for
Constantine.
Sorry, go ahead.
And I think Constantine would probably agree with me, if I was going to say.
I'm also a big fan of prevention. I much prefer not having the fire to helping somebody put it out. So my sort of take on the preventative part is establish some guardrails, especially around AI. There's going to be something that you know right away that you don't want your business doing. Maybe it's performance reviews with ChatGPT. Probably not maybe the best plan. Second, inventory. You'd be surprised how many places AI is already in your organization. Remember, those vendors keep sneaking stuff in. And you're going, you mean our HR has got AI in it? Our payroll does?
Yes.
Our CRM does? And you haven't really understood the risk, and all the contracts, as George said, put the onus on you. So inventory. Then you can start thinking about what are the rules. Maybe there's some things we shouldn't put into certain systems. Maybe there are some tactics you can apply to mitigate the risk. Document it. Use, risk management tools to help you in actually documenting that you've done the right things. Because guess what, folks? You're not going to escape having a problem.
That's right. And for those of you that aren't sure about AI, with the birth of AI, obviously comes the what essentially the regulations that tie around it, or frameworks, as we say. So there already is an ISO framework 42001. That's an artificial intelligence management system. And as a buyer, you can ask a company that is using artificial intelligence, especially service providers specifically, are you certified to ISO 42001? Right?
Or NIST.
You're not. NIST. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I like NIST too. NIST has a really good AI framework. Yep, that's another one you can ask. Yep.
Yeah, you try to cover all of them, but ultimately, that's as a buyer, that's a good strategy, but it doesn't absolve you from still requiring the management of your risk. So these framework certifications are not silver bullets. Oh wait, I got SOC 2, I'm good.
Yeah,
no worries, right?
Yeah.
It is a process, and that convergence of risk management and cybersecurity is the origin. So stay on top of that.
I love the bong because we are at the top of the hour, and I could sit and talk about this stuff. I mean, AI has been around forever, and we're talking about large language models and different things, and people are like, oh, it's AI. We could have a whole nother a whole nother session with you guys about this, but we're at the top of the hour. It like flew by, and so I unfortunately have to cut us a little bit short. But at the end of the day, there were questions. I'm going to get back to people who have asked the questions, and I'm going to actually have you guys even get back to people who have asked the questions, and maybe get a little more in depth into some of those questions. I'll leave it with a final thought. And I always, if we think about the movie Terminator, Terminator fighting Terminator, I was working with Volvo after Vera and the rest came back in heavy equipment. And they always said, well, we're not going to do any automation near any type of equipment that could be in any metropolitan area because of hacking. So think transformers, right? And I love, Constantine, that you said it's a matter of when, not if. So get ready. And Neil, I love the ethical hacking portion of it and some of the tools with that and the risk management. You guys are amazing. We're going to put a last slide up. We do have it for any questions for Omnistruct, but what I'm going to do is if you click on this or take the QR code and you have questions for Constantine or you have questions for Neil or George Uzzi, we'll just ferret those forward and we'll make sure that you guys get the answers that you're all looking for. And I want to thank everybody who did attend this, and we will be sending out the replay shortly. And thank you very much to our panelists. It was an amazing event. You guys are kind for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks very much, Valerie.
Yep. Appreciate you.